In the spring of 1944, deep within Berlin, a small group of German intelligence officers gathered in a sealed, dimly lit room. They leaned over a long wooden table buried beneath reconnaissance photographs, intercepted radio traffic, and neatly stacked field reports. Cigarette smoke hung heavy in the air, mixing with a tension that never fully dissipated. This was not a routine briefing on Allied troop movements or shipping lanes. They were not mapping divisions or tallying tanks. They were tracking a single man. One name surfaced again and again in their files, underlined, circled, marked with warning symbols. George S. Patton. For months, German High Command had devoted more intelligence effort to following this one American general than to any other Allied commander. Not Eisenhower, who oversaw the entire Allied war effort. Not Montgomery, the celebrated British victor of El Alamein. It was Patton whose location triggered alarms, whose appearance on a situation map caused red markers to multiply across German headquarters. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West, reviewed Patton-related reports with an intensity that bordered on fixation. Any fragment of intelligence hinting at where Patton might be, or where he might strike next, was placed at the top of his stack. Rundstedt had faced many capable Allied generals and respected several of them. But Patton unsettled him. There was something about him that felt different, something that felt dangerous. That unease had its origins in November 1942, when German forces first encountered Patton in combat. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, marked America's first large-scale ground engagement against the Axis. Patton commanded the Western Task Force, leading roughly 35,000 American troops ashore along the Atlantic coast of Morocco. German and Italian observers watched closely, eager to judge how this inexperienced U.S. Army would perform. They expected hesitation, slow, deliberate advances, the kind of cautious, methodical warfare American doctrine seemed to favor. Long preparations, massive firepower, movement only after everything was in place. That was not what unfolded. Within 3 days of landing, Patton's forces had taken Casablanca and accepted the French surrender. His units surged forward at a pace that stunned German analysts. Ground was covered in a blur. Movements came faster than intelligence officers believed American formations were capable of executing. Reports from the field described a commander advancing with an aggression that did not fit established Allied patterns. The reaction was immediate. Within weeks, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring in the Mediterranean theater requested a comprehensive intelligence profile. Who was this man? What was his background? How did he operate? The answers only deepened German concern. The dossier revealed an officer who had spent years immersed in the study of warfare, particularly German warfare. Patton read German military theorists in their original language. He had walked the old battlefields of France, studying where Kaiser Wilhelm's armies had driven forward in 1914 and again in 1918. He examined terrain firsthand, paced distances, traced trenches and attack routes with his own steps. He understood more than tactics. He grasped the German way of war: speed, shock, relentless concentration of force. As German officers read the reports, a troubling realization set in. This American had devoted decades to learning how they thought. Then came February 1943. At the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, German and Italian forces under Rommel smashed through inexperienced American units. U.S. lines collapsed. Vehicles clogged narrow roads. Formations disintegrated as soldiers broke and ran. It was the most severe battlefield humiliation the United States Army would suffer during the war. From Berlin's vantage point, the outcome at Kasserine appeared to confirm everything German intelligence believed. The Americans, they concluded, lacked experience. They possessed factories, manpower, and raw material, but not the hardness required for real war. German analysts waited to see how the United States would respond. Would they retreat into caution? Quietly replace a few commanders? Lose their appetite for bold operations and revert to slow, careful advances? The response came sooner than expected. In early March, George S. Patton was placed in command of 2 Corps, the same formation that had collapsed in chaos at Kasserine. Frontline intelligence officers noticed the change almost immediately. Within 2 weeks, units that had previously been in full retreat were moving forward again. Discipline tightened overnight. Helmets stayed on. Uniforms were cleaned. Vehicles were serviced and aligned to exacting standards. But the transformation went far beyond appearances. Patton reshaped the corps from the inside out. Training intensified. Expectations became unforgiving. Morale hardened under a combination of relentless pressure and Patton's unmistakable presence. A presence that made soldiers instinctively straighten when he passed. German reconnaissance reports soon carried a troubling message. American patrols were no longer hesitant. They no longer yielded ground easily. They probed aggressively. They pressed forward with confidence. Rommel himself noted the shift in his diary. The Americans, he wrote, had suddenly become far more dangerous. The speed of the change could not be explained by reinforcements or new equipment alone. Something fundamental had altered. Someone new was in command. And German intelligence made certain to remember the name. That summer, in July 1943, the Allies landed in Sicily. On paper, the campaign's spotlight belonged to Montgomery's British Eighth Army, tasked with driving up the island's eastern coast toward Messina. Patton's Seventh Army was officially assigned a supporting role, protecting the flank, securing ground behind the main advance. Patton had no intention of remaining in the background. Once ashore, he unleashed his forces across western and central Sicily with astonishing speed. Towns fell one after another. Columns surged forward so quickly that even his own staff struggled to keep up. German commanders found themselves reacting rather than planning. In just 39 days, Patton's troops fought through difficult terrain and reached Messina, having covered roughly 200 miles under combat conditions. He arrived ahead of Montgomery, despite starting farther away and advancing along a more difficult route. German after-action reports from Sicily revealed a mixture of admiration and unease. One officer remarked that Patton fought less like an American infantry commander and more like a panzer leader. He accepted risks Allied manuals generally discouraged. He struck before defenses could fully solidify. He drove into openings the moment they appeared, instead of waiting for perfect alignment. To German eyes, his behavior was unsettlingly familiar. He fought like their best commanders, only now he stood on the opposite side. Then, at the height of his success, Patton nearly destroyed himself. In August 1943, while touring evacuation hospitals in Sicily, he encountered rows of exhausted, traumatized soldiers. At the time, psychological injury from combat, what would later be understood as PTSD, was poorly recognized, often dismissed as weakness or lack of courage. Patton saw men classified as psychiatric casualties and, through the lens of his harsh personal beliefs, judged them as cowards who had failed their comrades. In two infamous incidents, he struck soldiers he believed were avoiding duty. In one case, he even drew his pistol and threatened to shoot. When news of the episodes reached Eisenhower, the reaction was explosive. The scandal spread quickly. Newspapers seized on the story. Editorials condemned Patton. Members of Congress demanded his removal. The general who had delivered critical victories in North Africa and Sicily suddenly appeared on the brink of disgrace. In Berlin, intelligence officers followed the unfolding crisis with fascination and cautious optimism. They had already concluded that Patton was the Allies' most dangerous commander. If the Americans chose to eliminate him for political reasons, it would be an extraordinary gift. But Eisenhower chose another path. After a severe reprimand, he did not dismiss Patton. He removed him from public view, sidelined him temporarily, but kept him in reserve. Patton was not gone. He was waiting. German analysts understood the situation clearly. Patton had not been discarded. He had been preserved. To them, that could only mean one thing. The Americans considered him too valuable to expend casually. If he was being held back, it was because he was intended for something decisive. By early 1944, Patton was in England, yet he was not visibly commanding any of the invasion forces preparing to cross the Channel. German intelligence knew he was there. They tracked his movements, noted his public appearances, and monitored the locations tied to his supposed headquarters. But when they studied the Allied order of battle for the coming invasion of Western Europe, his name was conspicuously absent from the list of commanders assigned to Normandy. The omission made no sense. German planners reasoned that the Allies would never sideline their most aggressive and effective field commander on the eve of the war's most critical operation. If Patton was not leading the invasion force in Normandy, then he must be preparing to strike elsewhere, at a point even more decisive, one that had not yet fully revealed itself. They were only partly wrong. Patton was indeed central to the Allied plan, but his role was one of illusion. The first U.S. Army group, supposedly under his command and positioned in southeastern England, did not truly exist. Its tanks were inflatable rubber shells. Its airfields were fake, constructed from painted canvas and plywood. Dummy camps were laid out with care. False radio traffic filled the airwaves, all designed to simulate the presence of a massive invasion force poised opposite the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest crossing of the English Channel. The Germans accepted the deception completely, convinced that wherever Patton stood must mark the true Schwerpunkt, the main point of attack. They concluded that any landings elsewhere could only be a diversion. Normandy, if assaulted, would be a feint. The real blow, they believed, would fall at Calais under Patton's command. When Allied troops stormed ashore on June 6, 1944, on the beaches of Normandy, nearly 150 miles from Calais, German commanders watched with uncertainty. Was this the long-anticipated main invasion, or merely a preliminary move meant to draw German reserves away from the real target? Rundstedt and other senior commanders urged immediate action. They wanted to throw panzer divisions against the fragile beachhead before it could harden. But in Berlin, Hitler remained fixated on Calais and on Patton. The Führer and his staff believed the decisive landing was still to come, led by the general they feared most. For 6 crucial weeks, powerful armored formations remained positioned near the Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an attack that would never arrive. Those panzer divisions, units that might have crushed the Allies during the vulnerable early days in Normandy, sat idle, immobilized by the expectation of a strike commanded by George S. Patton. When Patton finally returned to active combat on August 1, 1944, assuming command of the U.S. Third Army, the Germans understood instantly that their nightmare had become real. Released from his role in deception, Patton entered Normandy and transformed the campaign. In the first 2 weeks of August, his army advanced farther than some Allied units had managed in 2 months of brutal hedgerow fighting. Third Army exploded out of the breakout at Avranches, surged into Brittany, seized critical ports, then pivoted east in a sweeping maneuver across France. German formations that had spent weeks building defensive positions suddenly found American columns behind them, cutting roads, severing supply lines, striking headquarters and communications centers. Reports from the front grew increasingly desperate. The Americans seemed to be everywhere at once. Front lines dissolved, reappearing miles away within hours. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who had replaced Rundstedt as senior commander in the West, began receiving messages that painted a grim picture of a battlefield spinning out of control. The senior German commander in the West found himself staring at maps that no longer reflected reality. He would draw a line to mark the front, only for fresh reports to arrive showing that Patton had already crossed it. Orders dispatched to divisions often became obsolete before they were even received. Units marched toward objectives that no longer mattered, only to discover that Third Army had slipped around them yet again. German staff officers began describing Patton's advance as a flood, one that could not be dammed, only endured as it swept past. By mid-August, Patton recognized an opportunity to deliver a decisive blow. German forces withdrawing from Normandy were being funneled through a narrowing corridor near the town of Falaise. If the gap could be sealed, hundreds of thousands of enemy troops, along with what remained of their tanks, guns, and transport, would be trapped. Patton drove Third Army northward while Canadian and Polish forces closed in from the opposite direction. As the corridor tightened, the retreat collapsed into panic. Roads filled with desperate columns of soldiers. Vehicles were abandoned when fuel ran out or when Allied aircraft struck from above. Command structures dissolved. Units lost contact with headquarters. The Falaise pocket became a killing ground. More than 50,000 German soldiers were captured. Thousands more were killed. The destruction of armor, artillery, and transport was catastrophic. Officers who survived later said the experience was worse than Stalingrad in some respects. At Stalingrad, they argued, there had been time to dig in, to organize defenses, to prepare. Against Patton, there was no pause, only relentless pressure. They felt pursued, driven, crushed forward without a moment to recover. After the war, Allied interrogators questioned captured German generals about the commanders they had faced. Their responses were revealing. Montgomery, they said, was capable and disciplined, but predictable. He favored extensive preparation and overwhelming force, making his operations easier to anticipate. Bradley was described as steady and cautious, a commander who adhered closely to doctrine and rarely took risks. When the subject turned to Patton, their tone changed. Words like unpredictable, aggressive, and dangerous surfaced again and again. Rundstedt stated openly that Patton was the Allied general he feared most. General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the elite Panzer Lehr division, remarked that Patton was the only Allied leader who truly possessed the instincts of a German panzer commander. He reminded them of Rommel, bold, opportunistic, constantly searching for weakness. Only this time, Rommel's mirror image was driving American tanks. Patton did not fight according to the safety-first assumptions German officers associated with Western Allied commanders. He advanced when doctrine called for consolidation. He pressed forward when logisticians advised a pause. He launched attacks that appeared premature on paper, yet succeeded through speed and surprise. German planners, accustomed to identifying patterns in their opponent's behavior, found him deeply unsettling. They could never be certain where he would strike next. They only knew that when he did, it would be sudden and violent. Then came December 1944, and Germany's final gamble in the West. In the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, Hitler launched a massive surprise offensive, aiming to split the Allied armies and seize the vital port of Antwerp. The attack smashed through thinly held American lines, throwing units backward and spreading confusion across the front. Soon, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded in the town of Bastogne, cut off and under intense pressure. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting at Verdun. He asked his field commanders how quickly they could mount a counterattack to relieve Bastogne and halt the German advance. Most responses were measured in weeks. Time to reposition large formations in winter conditions, reroute supply lines, disengage from current operations, and establish a new axis of advance. All of it required patience, careful planning, time. Patton offered something else. He said he could attack in 48 hours, with 3 divisions. The room fell silent. Other generals stared at him in disbelief. It sounded like bravado, another bold claim unsupported by logistics or reality. You did not rotate an entire army 90 degrees and throw it into a major battle in 2 days. But Patton held an advantage no one else in the room possessed. Patton had anticipated the blow before it fell. Weeks earlier, his intelligence chief, Oskar Koch, had warned that German divisions were quietly disappearing from the front, slipping out of contact and massing somewhere beyond Allied view. While other headquarters dismissed the idea of a major German offensive, convinced the enemy was exhausted, depleted, and incapable of large-scale action, Patton listened. He made no speeches. He issued no dramatic warnings. Instead, he ordered contingency plans drawn up for precisely such a scenario, quietly, methodically, in advance. So when the Ardennes suddenly erupted in fire and steel, Patton did not need time to think. He needed only to act. One phone call was enough. Plans that had been drafted, revised, and rehearsed came alive instantly. Third Army began its massive pivot north almost at once. More than 250,000 men and tens of thousands of vehicles poured onto narrow, icy roads. Traffic bottlenecks threatened disaster. Supply lines had to be reversed mid-flow. Command posts were torn down and rebuilt facing an entirely new direction. But the system held, because it had been prepared to hold. German planners, confident they had at least a week before any serious Allied counterattack could be organized, were stunned when Patton struck their southern flank within days. The brutal winter march toward Bastogne, the armored thrust that punched through to the encircled 101st Airborne on December 26th, and the relentless pressure Third Army applied along the southern edge of the Bulge combined to suffocate Germany's last major offensive in the West. After the war, German generals were asked what had gone wrong during the Battle of the Bulge. Many gave the same answer in different words. They had misjudged time. They had calculated in weeks. Patton responded in days. Once again, they had underestimated how quickly he could move. And once again, the error proved fatal. So why did German commanders fear George S. Patton more than any other Allied general? The answer lay in a deeply unsettling reflection they saw whenever they studied his campaigns. Patton understood them. German military doctrine revolved around speed, concentration, shock, and relentless exploitation of weakness. Blitzkrieg, the doctrine that had shattered Poland, overrun France, and driven deep into the Soviet Union, was built on those principles. German officers had lived by them for years. Then they encountered an enemy commander who operated from the same intellectual foundation. Patton had spent decades absorbing German military thought. He read their manuals, studied their theorists, walked their old battlefields, internalized their concepts. When he commanded armies, he turned those ideas back against them. He moved faster than they expected. He attacked before they believed conditions were ready. He denied them the pause they needed to regroup and rebuild coherent lines. And he did it with American industrial power behind him. There was another element that intensified their fear. With most Allied commanders, German analysts could identify patterns. One general would always wait for overwhelming force. Another would never attack without full air superiority. A third would protect his flanks at all costs. Those patterns made prediction possible. Patton shattered prediction. He attacked when calculations said he would halt. He advanced when logistics suggested a pause. He accepted the risk of overextension if it meant seizing the initiative. And more often than not, those risks succeeded. German planners never knew exactly what he would do next. They only knew he would rarely choose the safe, predictable option. That uncertainty unsettled them deeply. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who had commanded German forces during D-Day and faced many of the Allies' strongest generals, summarized his judgment after the war in stark terms. Patton, he said, was the supreme master of mobile warfare among the Allies, the most brilliant offensive commander they faced, and the one they feared above all others. From the deserts of North Africa to the hills of Sicily, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, George S. Patton earned that fear. Battle by battle, advance by advance, he forced Germany's most experienced commanders to experience what they had once inflicted on others, the disorienting shock of facing an enemy who thought the same way they did, only faster, more relentless, and backed by inexhaustible strength.